watch. So, Paul, Moran, take it away.
Thank you, Greg. I want to add my welcome to Greg's for all of you, and thank you for coming. This issue of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is obviously a pressing one for all of us as Jews and as Zionists, but particularly so for us as Democrats, because it's so painful to see this poison spreading within the party. To think about it with us, we have a very excellent panel of four speakers. I'm going to introduce each. They will have 5 minutes to pontificate, and then we'll have a discussion together. Our first speaker is Vlad Khaykin. Vlad serves as Executive Vice President of Social Impact and Partnerships for North America at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, one of the world's foremost human rights organizations dedicated to confronting anti-Semitism.
You're
Paul, we
muted.
just lost you. You're muted.
Yeah, everybody got muted somehow.
Yeah, it's my bad. I pushed the wrong button.
Yeah. Cool.
Let me back up a bit.
If you speak, go ahead and unmute yourself. Otherwise, please stay muted.
Sorry. So we're talking about Vlad Khaykin. In his role at the Wiesenthal Center, Vlad oversees advocacy, research, and strategic partnerships that advance the Wiesenthal Center's mission to build a more inclusive society and a more resilient democracy. Previously, Vlad served as Director of Public Research and Knowledge at the Anti Defamation League, where he advanced cutting-edge research on anti-Semitism and hate. A former refugee from state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union and the grandson of Holocaust survivors, Vlad has 5 minutes to take the floor. Go ahead, Vlad.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, and I appreciate the opportunity to address this organization. I will jump right in and start exactly where you left off, which is that I began my life here in the United States as a refugee. I fled the Soviet Union with my family in the late 1980s. Which is to say we fled state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union. And that has really, I think, shaped much of my life, much of my career, and much of how I've understood the world. So I'm going to start by actually sharing my screen, if I may. Let's see if that still works. Because I want to make my point in part visually. All right, so let's see if this works. Here we go.
Glad to see minute, folks. I had paused we're recording this so that we can post this later, and so I'm going to resume the recording. My apologies, Vlad.
No worries.
He'll get his time back, right?
I hope so. Let me know when I can resume.
All right, go right ahead. It should be working now.
Okay, great. So I want to make basically 6 points about why I think that anti-Zionism is in fact a form of anti-Semitism. Before I do that, though, I want to address one word, which is new. I don't think it's new. Whatever it is, it's certainly not new. It's been around for over a century at this point, century and a half almost. And so I don't think it's new. You can go back to Wilhelm Marr, the guy who coined the term anti-Semitism, right? An anti-Semite himself. And you can see that he had views on anti-Zionism that I think were very much reflective of his anti-Semitic views. Those were later, I think decades later, influenced Adolf Hitler, who used very similar language to describe anti-Zionism in Mein Kampf. So again, whatever it is, it's certainly not new. Now, is it anti-Semitism? So I think it is, and I'll make 6 points here. And the first one is exactly as I was saying, which is that any ideology should be evaluated on the basis of the material conditions that it creates on the ground. Every ideology tries to advance itself in terms of its own self-branding with very lovely language, inspiring, beautiful sort of slogans, etc. The Democratic People's Republic of North Korea is neither democratic nor, serving the people, and yet, it brands itself as something other than what it is. So I think if we, one of my sort of pet peeves is that these discussions are usually had on the level of theory, right? Which is to say that they're abstracted from the lived experience of actual living, breathing Jews. There are, millions of Jews alive today who can tell you exactly what it was like for Jewish people in anti-Zionist societies, which is pretty much uniformly terrible. It was a story of disenfranchisement, dispossession, displacement, harassment, and in some cases, murder. And so I think that is something that we should look at. Somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million Jews were displaced in the 20th century as a result of anti-Zionism from anti-Zionist regimes, right? So, and I think that's, how we should really think about this is what does it do in practice? Not how does it frame itself in terms of selling itself as an ideology, but rather what does it do when it's implemented in a society? And pretty much everywhere where it's been embraced as a matter of policy, it has led to displacement, dispossession, dislocation, disenfranchisement, etc. of Jews. Number two, it denies the only reliable means of refuge, rescue, and self-defense that Jews have in a world still beset by genocidal anti-Semitism. And it generally provides no viable alternative, certainly not one that Jews can trust. After all, during World War II, basically every nation slammed the door in the face of the Jews at our most desperate hour, right? And so the Jews learned from that. They learned that they would need to take matters of their own safety into their own hands and create a refuge, create a place where they could have an army that could defend Jews and could mount rescue operations as Jews did over the coming decades after the founding of the state of Israel, rescued Jews from Yemen, from Ethiopia, etc. Right? Many of these places where they had anti-Zionist regimes and were harassing, murdering, interning Jews, etc. Number three, it denies the right to self-determination and statehood to the Jewish people. This is an enumerated right under international law. Israel was created as a UN member state to serve as a state for the Jewish people. Oftentimes, those who deny that right to the Jews will affirm it for other groups. In other words, there's a kind of double standard there. And if you study any form of bigotry, double standards tend to be one of the hallmarks that you will find across, forms of bigotry, right? So that's number three. Number four, in order to do that work, in order to deny the right to self-determination and statehood to Jews, anti-Zionism often assaults Jewish identity, history, the connection between the land and the people, right? It distorts our history. It rends us from our culture. It's, says things about us that we generally reject, right? And so, again, I think that is another indicator of anti-Semitism. Number five, again, in order to do its job, anti-Zionism oftentimes leverages classic forms of anti-Semitic ideas, stereotypes, conspiracy theories, etc. In it may be a slightly modified form. After all, anti-Semitism always dresses for the occasion, right? If it comes to seduce the left, it'll speak in the language and the values and the frameworks of the left. If it speaks to the right, it'll speak in the language and values of the right. If it comes to seduce Christians, it will speak in the language of the Gospels. So it's constantly taking on different forms. But fundamentally, anti-Zionism uses a lot of the same classical tropes and stereotypes and conspiracy theories that we know from classical anti-Semitism over millennia, right? And lastly, it fuels the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When you look at all the violence, the wars that have beset the region, right, the Near East, the Levant, it is always a function of anti-Zionist regimes coming to wipe Israel off the map, right? So, in other words, in my view, the bloodshed, both of Jews and also of Palestinians and other Arabs, is primarily the function of anti-Zionism, right? So I believe that certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is harmful to Jews. It's also harmful to their neighbors, and it's primarily driven by anti-Zionism. So also for that reason, I would also argue that anti-Semitism is a form, that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism because it perpetuates violence against not only our people, but our neighbors, cuts us off from our cousins, and so on. So I'll end it there because I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vlad. There's a lot to chew on there. We're going to hear now from Lauren Post. Lauren is a researcher and writer. Online, she focuses on building healthy online communities, fact-checking, and bridging the gaps between Jewish communities and their local and state-level governments. In her current position with Anti Defamation League, she tracks and reports on trends in the Jewish and Israel worlds, translating data and into actionable items for her teammates. She currently serves on the board of Temple Ner Shalom and the Progressive Zionists of California. Previously, she served as Israel Policy Forum's National Non-Chapter City Chair and the California Young Jewish Democratic Caucus Central Director. Lauren, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I apologize if I look a little weird. Spectrum has an outage in my neighborhood, so I'm on my phone and we are doing our best today. And thank you all for taking the time to come and listen to us yap about this very important topic. I'm really excited to talk with Susan, Vlad, and Matthew. It's been a long time since we had the opportunity to do that. So I want to go look through what does the data tell us about the relationship between anti-Zionist sentiment and anti-Semitism. The ADL puts out our annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. We're actually going to be releasing the data for 2025 very soon, hopefully no later than the end of May. Let's hope. Fingers crossed. But we can go through last year's data too, and just get a sense of what that relationship looks like. Vlad talked about the impact on real human beings' lived experiences and their lived experiences with anti-Semitism and that relationship to anti-Zionism. So if you haven't given it a read, it's pretty long and it's on our website, but let's just go through the top line points. So 2024 had been, up until this point, one of the worst years, the worst year for anti-Semitic incidents since we started reporting and recording these incidents in the late 1970s. So we've been doing this for 40-ish years at this point, and this was the worst year by far. There were over 9,000 incidents reported, which is an increase of 5% compared to 2023, which was also a record-setting year. Perhaps not unsurprising, 2023, obviously, there was October 7th. There was that major spike at the end of the year, kind of quieted down in the winter. And then by the spring, a lot of our incidents were actually at the encampments. I see your faces. You're not shocked. That should probably not come as a surprise too much to anybody. We also had a 21% increase of 196 violent assaults. Orthodox Jews were targeted in 30% of these incidents nationally. And more interestingly, for our purposes in this conversation, for the first time in the history of the audit, a majority, so 58% of all of our incidents contained elements related to Israel or Zionism. And this was mostly found in our rallies, Los Angeles, the greater Southern California area. No surprise, no stranger rather to those big protests and rallies that happen downtown and LA every so often. They're all around. Even my town, I live in San Luis Obispo, and we even get some every so often. And they're kind of icky from time to time. So all around California, we shouldn't be too surprised. And so we tracked 5,000 rallies last year. And about half of more than those 5,000 rallies contained an anti-Semitic expression, and many of those included Israel or Zionism as a part of that anti-Semitic expression. Also, perhaps unsurprisingly, the incidents on colleges and university campuses rose perhaps more steeply than any other location. Notice that, 18% of all incidents took place at that location. So not great. Perhaps, kind of jives with the news themselves towards this. No, like we're not hallucinating. Like colleges are a pretty acutely bad place for anti-Semitic incidents, and especially around Zionism. The conversation just kind of declined enormously. And so based on those attitudes and incidents, we're really seeing a mainstream and normalization of anti-Semitism, especially around Israel, the likes of which we haven't seen before in this country for many, many years. And it creates an environment where Jewish individuals face increasing harassment and facing attitudes and environments where it wasn't even thinkable like 10 years ago. So it's just really emboldened in a way that we've really never seen before. And this is a problem across the political spectrum. I think for a long time, people on like the right specifically really wanted to look at this as a left problem, and people on the left really wanted to be like, this is a right-wing problem. My people don't do this. And unfortunately, the data says it's a little complicated how you talk about those attitudes and how your attitudes are kind of anti-Semitic, but you're still doing it. And maybe our attitude should be, you should probably not do that. So my specialty at the ADL, my subject matter is in the Center on Extremism, which is where I work, is anti-Israel, anti-Zionism. Opposition, to be very clear, ADL takes the position that you can criticize Israel all you want, all day, have fun, go bananas. We do it a lot. If you've ever heard me talk about Israel in my spare time, you know I have plenty of thoughts on the matter. And if you want to we ought to have that conversation about it later, like, let's do it, have fun. We'll go off to the races. It's really when you start delegitimizing the idea of Jewish right to self-determination that it starts to get a little complicated, and that's something that ADL does consider to be anti-Semitic. And so for things that we're including as anti-Semitic is maybe a heuristic to understand anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism in the way that is like real and practical and maybe not just like internet sloganeering. We'll include things that are explicit support for terrorism. So yay, October 7th, that was awesome. I know we've all heard that in some way, shape, or form. They globalize the Intifada. We're setting our people free from the Zionist occupation, which we've heard shouted at city council meetings, so on and so forth. I think a very good tangible example of where anti-Zionism could in theory not be necessarily anti-Semitism is when you're protesting land sales outside of synagogues. If you could keep it to, I don't like you selling these particular properties in this highly contested area because XYZ reason. Okay, I have better things to do on a Saturday night than go shout about that. But like, okay, that's a policy preference. That's a disagreement on like what should be allowed in that way. But then when you look at what happens at those protests, that is a very different story. You know, people are getting into fistfights for starters, which is, again, not something ADL will inherently consider anti-Semitism. But then you look at what's being hurled at each other when they're getting into these fights. You know, it's the explicit support for terrorism. I have seen more Abu Abeda pins at some of those protests than I care to think about. I've seen more, other terrorist propaganda and other terrorist organization paraphernalia than I care to think about sometimes. And that's really the difference. That's not necessarily a opposition to this very specific policy thing. This is an opposition entirely to Israel. And so you're going into these synagogue spaces, not necessarily to disagree with this policy thing, but you're to delegitimize the entire country and delegitimize this community's relationship to Israel and to Jewish self-determination in the first place.
Lauren, I'm going to wrap up, please.
Sure. If we're very deliberate about that and how we do our counting, and if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. But that's just one, I think, tangible example of how we can do that. And I will wrap that up so either Susan or Matt can yap next. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I hope we're all preparing our questions for the panel. Put those into the chat, and we'll ask those in a bit. Our next speaker is Matthew Finkelstein, who is a San Francisco-based development and sales professional with deep experience in community advocacy and civic engagement. As a founding board member of the watchdog and research nonprofit Intelligent Advocacy Network, he helps advance the organization's mission to address misinformation and promote transparency, accountability, and responsible stewardship of public resources. Matthew is a Democratic State Central Committee delegate and serves on the executive boards of multiple Jewish Democratic clubs and civic organizations. He also serves as a lay cantor in San Francisco. Susan George is the CEO of the aforementioned Intelligent Advocacy Network, where she leads efforts to advance transparency and oversight of public institutions and expose extremism in tax-exempt organizations. She also serves as executive director of Progressive Zionists of California, addressing anti-Semitism within progressive spaces and advancing principled value-based advocacy within the California Democratic Party. She has also served multiple terms as both an elected Assembly District delegate to the California Democratic Party and a National Democratic Convention delegate. So, Matthew, please go ahead.
Okay, we should probably start at the beginning. I think some of this is going to sound somewhat familiar probably accord with much of your own experience. We've talked a lot about whether or not anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but I think we need to actually ground this in our real experience as Democrats. That's who I'm talking to. So this is a story about the Democratic Party. My positions have since evolved, so please don't think you're talking to someone who's a dyed-in-the-wool Bernie Sanders supporter till the day he dies. But in any event, this all began for us around 2017. I can tell you, anyone who knows me can tell you that I'm seldom stuck for words. Well, I went into a state of worldless shock at the 2017 Democratic Party convention in California. There, during the largest caucus meeting in California Democratic Party history, some of you will recall, the Progressive Caucus gave David Mandel the privilege of doing a PowerPoint presentation, and it featured standards that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Israel is an apartheid state, Zionism is racism, and of course the IDF is committing genocide. All this was in support of a BDS divestment motion. This is not why we were there at the convention. We were Bernie Sanders supporters, and I thought we were all there for healthcare for all, taxing billionaires, and free college tuition. When the call went out for speakers in opposition to this BDS resolution, I remember this distinctly. My mouth went dry. I started to sweat looking around at all these people, and I'm just frozen. But I'm looking down at the ground, and I see a pair of feet making their way down the aisle rapidly, and I look up, and behold, it's my fiance, my love, Susan George, my hero, and she's marching right to the mic, and she fearlessly takes apart the proposition. She says, basically, in a nutshell, endorsing BDS means endorsing one of the key columns, which is called anti-normalization. And that means that we would have to actively deplatform and shut out other Democrats who are Israeli or Zionist. That's an obvious and flagrant violation of the party's core charter. So the motion isn't proper. Well, the motion goes forward anyway. We lose the motion, not surprisingly, but the surprises were there. There were a few votes on Susan's side. But it was afterwards, when we were sitting at the table right outside the caucus, that the shame of what had just happened kind of hit me. I'm usually the big, vocal water buffalo, but Susan was there patting my back and consoling me. And shortly, people started approaching from the caucus as they were pouring out. And before I knew it, we were surrounded by tons of sympathetic people, and all of them were feeling the same way. Which is to say, when these kinds of resolutions go forward, Jews feel isolated, betrayed by their own party, and afraid. So that's the moment that I found my voice, when I saw the mirror in other people's experience. That's really important, because it's that realization serves as at the core of what I think fundamentally changed both my life and Susan's. I said to myself, and I said to everyone there, in fact, we can't let this happen again. I slammed my hand down on the table. We can never let this happen again. We're going to provision a steady Zionist presence in every caucus and committee meeting in the party. And I said, we'll be the progressive Zionists of California. And that's kind of, we had several iterations if that's where we got to. But that heralded the beginning of a long time of party activism. I'm not going to get into all the details, but it also heralded the emergence, that 2017, when all those progressives poured in, the emergence of anti-Zionism, not healthcare for all, not the Green Revolution, not taxing billionaires, but I would put anti-Zionism as the core organizing principle for the new far left of the party. And let me prove that statement, because that's a big statement. Okay, so in years ahead, this would prove to be the case. I can't remember the year exactly. I think it was 2019. We had a presence in most of the party rooms, and we were keeping time on subject matter. We were curious about how much time was going to discuss Israel and Palestine. So in that year, and in years ahead, Israel and Palestine would be the single biggest fixation the time cost expenditure issue for committees and caucuses whose focus really ought to be on any number of other problems not located 7,500 miles away. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, okay? Because we're not getting that time back to do the right things on behalf of the people of the state. And we're not focusing on the things that elected Democrats should be doing, namely making California a better place. So no matter what we say about anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism or not, there's no question that it's undermining the values that win us elections with bread and butter voters who don't wake up with Israel and Palestine front of mind. Okay. With that said, I do feel the need to speak to the subject at hand a little bit. Is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And my clear answer is that anti-Zionism may not be anti-Semitism precisely in some rhetorical contexts. But what I can say safely is that the modern anti-Zionist movement are not filled with principled ideological anti-Zionists from any kind of orthodoxy. They are by and large a milieu of people who don't know what the river is or what river it is or which sea it is. And they are animated largely by anti-Semitic motives. So let's just state it unequivocally. Here it is. The modern anti-Zionist movement is an anti-Semitic movement. That I can say wholeheartedly. And that's my boiled down version of it. But what remains for us tonight are some bigger questions as Democrats. This is where I really want to take us to. We're all Democratic Party activists. What does this stuff look like in the party? What are we going to do about it? Before we move on to Susan George, I just want to say something really quick. Today, in fact, 2 hours before this recording even began, we spoke with Scott Wiener. And I was like, man, why did you have to use the G word, genocide? For those of you who don't know, his opponent, Chakrabarti, I don't remember his first name, he literally said, I'm going to make Israel the driving issue of this election for this congression. Okay? It's a chutzpahdik thing to say, but this is what I told him. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because you're going to be in conversation with lots of legislators, and I hope this is helpful, because these are my thoughts about how we should adapt. Okay, so what I said is, our club thinks you made, we're a Jewish Democratic Club, a strategic error by caving into Chakrabarti's demand that Israel be made front and center of his campaign. And when you agreed with him, essentially, by saying that Israel is committing a genocide, that was playing right into his trap. Californians are struggling with medical bills and rent. And if your opponents want Israel to feature so heavily, then the fact that you are the front runner and that you are Jewish can't be a coincidence. This is a maximum pressure campaign to try to push you into a dual loyalty corner. So if you defend Israel, they then paint you that way, but you don't have to spend all your time defending Israel. The response to this from you should be clear. My opponents seek to make a conflict 7,500 miles away the central push of their campaign. They are not serving the pressing and immediate needs of Californians who need the help of principled leadership to put their immediate needs first. On Israel, I will hold with fellow Democrats who seek to bring Netanyahu to account. My first priority will always be with the safety, prosperity of the people of California. I would wish that yours would be as well. And that's just the straightforward dope that I gave him, and I hope he listened. Anyway, here's Susan. We're going to go a little more into detail about this question of what we should be doing as Democrats, but we cannot be gaslit into thinking that this isn't happening, and we need robust responses.
Should I go ahead? Is it?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you.
Paul, do you want to introduce Susan?
Yes, Greg.
I introduced Susan earlier, so please go ahead, Susan.
Yeah. We did a handoff there. So first of all, thank you, Vlad. Thank you, Lauren, Matthew. Just incredible information. And I'm using this event as an opportunity. It really got me thinking, because we named ourselves Progressive Zionism of California very deliberately, because we knew that's where the wave was coming, that it was all going to be about Zionism. And unfortunately, I think anti-Zionists have kind of been leading us by the nose, to be perfectly honest with you. I want to talk about the work we're doing with Intelligent Advocacy Network as well. but I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to put some things in context. And these are very new ideas for me. It's sort of a learning from the work we've done so far and bringing it in here with all of you today. It's very good to be here. There is a particular kind of political foolishness that masquerades as moral courage. The growing pressure to treat the existence of Israel as an open question is a perfect example. When Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, he gave us a timeless warning, a man who charged windmills with absolute conviction. This speaks to the very real and dangerous problem of modern-day anti-Zionism, furious, self-righteous, and completely untethered from reality. Israel exists. That is not an option. It is a legal, historical, and geopolitical fact settled since 1948. And like every sovereign nation, Israel is not beyond criticism. Its military policies, the condition of the people in Gaza, the unchecked violence of Jewish extremists in the West Bank, the expansion of settlements, these are necessary conversations. We should be having them. Moral seriousness demands nothing less. But anti-Zionism is not criticism. It is the rejection of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, dressed in the language of human rights, wielded as a political weapon, and increasingly tolerated in spaces that would never accept the equivalent denial of any other people's existence. A party that cannot draw that line appears captured. And when leaders validate, even through silence, those who seek not accountability but annihilation, they don't create honest conversation, they create permission. I want to be direct. We are not in a moment that allows for hedging or institutional politeness. Anti-Zionism is no longer a fringe phenomenon. It is a moving toward the center of our politics, our institutions, and our culture with a speed that should alarm everyone in this room. And the response from too many of our allies has ranged from inadequate to complicit. That ends when we decide it ends, and that decision has to happen now. But arguments alone don't change conditions. Words don't investigate where the money goes. That is why the Intelligent Advocacy Network exists. IAN, Intelligent Advocacy Network, another acronym, does not tilt at windmills. It identifies real threats, documents them, and pursues accountability through the mechanisms that matter. When political abdication creates a vacuum, that vacuum gets filled by organizations exploiting civil rights language to advance extremist agendas, by academic programs using taxpayer dollars to platform networks linked to designated terrorist organizations, by advocacy groups misappropriating federal funds while their leadership celebrates Hamas. IAN files complaints with the Department of Justice, with the California Attorney General, with the IRS, with the Fair Political Practices Commission. Paper trails, tax filings, documented evidence. That is how a compelling argument becomes actionable accountability. Every person, every organization in this room has a role to play. Name anti-Zionism for what it is. Hold your political allies accountable and understand that silence right now is not neutrality. History will record it as a choice. The windmills in Cervantes were imaginary. What we face is not. And unlike Quixote, we know exactly what we are fighting. We have the evidence, we have the institutions, we have the people in this room. What this moment demands is the will to use them boldly, urgently, and together.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was an impressive bunch of presentations. Everyone is invited to formulate your questions, use the chat function to bring them to us, and we'll ask the panelists. Now I'd like to turn over the meeting to my colleague, Miran Kalajian, to begin the question and answer portion of the program.
First of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this panel. We have already some questions, and before I ask these questions, we are going to start in order of Vlad, Lorraine, Matthew, and Susan. And my first question is, it's widely agreed that mere criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, but do we really believe it as a practical matter? How do we Zionists deal with those among us who are so over-sanitized to anti-Semitism that they reject even reasonable criticism of Israel as Jew hatred?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but it's a good one. So, I mean, first of all, I think, it has to be said that, and I often make this point that if you want to hear robust criticism of Israel, its policies, its politicians, you can find no better source than the Israeli press, right? And you'll have critiques from the left, you'll have critiques from the right, you'll have critiques that come from a religious sort of disposition, from a secular one, et cetera. But, do the people know the Jews? Of course, we have critiques. I don't know any Jew who doesn't have some misgivings, some critiques about Israel, about its policies. We all feel like I feel like it's almost a guiding principle of the Jewish people that the way things are is not necessarily the way that they have to be, right? And so like Jews are always imagining different, imagining better, right? So that's the first thing I would say. I mean, the second thing I would say is that a lot of this comes from a place of being embattled, right? Of feeling constantly gaslit, of feeling constantly backed into a corner. I think, being able to withstand critique, tolerate critique, engage with critique, requires a certain sense of groundedness, right? You have to feel like your feet are planted on the ground. And I think Jews are constantly put into a position where we don't feel that way. We don't feel secure. And I think, for many Jews, they're unwilling to tolerate even mild criticism simply because so much of that criticism gets twisted into essentially assaults on the legitimacy of Israel's existence. Not that it's like, hey, this society could be improved, but actually this society needs to disappear whole cloth. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, the point needs to be made. Anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israel because, in order to critique something, it has to exist. Anti-Zionism is the negation, calls for annihilation or dissolution of the would-be object of critique, right? And so, but yeah, I mean, I think, you have to maintain your sort of objectivity. You have to retain a certain sense of principle engagement on these questions, because when people see that you model sort of equitable application of standards, right? I think that models good behavior in others as well. So when people see that we hold the same standards that we would for Israel as we do for Palestine, that we do for Jews as we would for Arabs. I think that makes people more willing to engage, and more willing also to maybe compromise. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's what I got for you.
Thank you. Lauren.
A tricky question, and I'm so empathetic to folks trying to figure out the best way to navigate it. My first thought is always, what is my relationship to this person? Because if I'm not in relationship with you, if you're not someone I spend a lot of time with, if you're not someone I'm close to, that will determine quite a lot of how much emotional energy I'm willing to expend on that topic in the first place. Like talking about Israel and talking about policy, like I'm a policy dork. I love that stuff. There is a limit to how much bad faith argumentation I'm willing to like get into if I don't care about you, or if there's like not really a reason for me to be in conversation or relationship with you in the first place. So like, I'm not going to spend my time arguing with some like rando person on the internet. Like I have a 2-year-old, I have things to do. Like I have so many other better things to be doing. But like, if you're a person that I care deeply about, like I have very critical of Israel colleagues who like, that criticism doesn't always come from a place of deep knowledge, but they know they care about me and I care about them. So I'm willing to take the time to have that deeper conversation. And it doesn't always change their mind about the topic, but they're like, I see you are reasonable. Like I see, like to Vlad's point, like you're a normal person. You think about this normally. I have questions, and they have asked me later on, like, hey, like I got this question, a colleague actually she was in a Discord server, for example, and this guy from Lebanon, he's like, I have an uncle who works at the Lebanese embassy, and he said Israel funds Hamas. I was like, okay, and honestly, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, that one in particular, because it's so goofy. But like, she knew that she could ask me that question in the first place because we'd had other like more interesting conversations about Israel and the conflict in the past. Because for her, she's not Jewish. She's like, why does ADL always spend so much time talking about Israel? Like, I came here because we're a civil rights organization. Like, you know what? That's a phenomenal tension to hold in both of your hands. So that's my first, like, wait, like, what is your relationship to that person? I think we spend a lot of time trying to change minds on the internet, or like with random people that we don't really know. And why? I don't know. Maybe tilting at windmills is a really good, I think, analogy for that. Yeah, that's like my main thing when I'm thinking about how do we like change arguments, and then one person at a time. It's not a sexy answer, but person by person, you go. My colleague, for example, she brought back all these articles I had sent, and he just stopped like arguing with her, and that shut down a conversation in a pretty good Discord, and like a pretty large Discord channel. Like, all right, that's a W in my book. You stopped talking about it, and you talked about other things that are more relevant to the Discord channel. Fantastic. So yeah, they really think about, where is my emotional energy going?
Thank you, Lauren. Matthew.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be quick. Please, but conserve as much of your emotional energy as you can. These are incredibly trying times. There's a horde of people who are just essentially unconvincible. And for the most part, the majority of them are not your problem, and you shouldn't seek to make them your problem. And be respectful, keep doors open, let them know that you're there. And if you walk away leaving a good impression, who knows? Maybe you'll be reapproached. But for the most part, it's a giant waste of time when you're talking about randos, for sure. But as a Democratic club, and with whom I'm speaking to today, your concerns are different. You're going to occasionally meet like a real stubborn legislator, or someone who's a committee chair who's going to be deeply and have whole deep antipathy towards Israel and Jews, and you may have to like advance a conversation. Well, there's two ways to go about that. The first is that you keep an open line of communication. That's not one that you easily cut. You show them that you're open to dialogue and discussion, right? That's a valuable conversation to have. But if they're not convincible, you are a Democratic club, and you're certainly not beyond like political organization as like a direct mobilization, right? So when someone won't leave you any dignity in the conversation, you have to remove them from any various numbers of important conversations if you can, right? And those include the ones that govern important outcomes in the Democratic Party for your community. So yeah, like that's a good reason for them to be talking to you anyway. And if you don't pose a threat to them, like there's no reason for them to take you seriously. And I hate to put it in such stark terms, but these are politics. There's a lot of all or nothing propositions in politics, and I encourage you to remind people of that, because the pro-Palestinian side never hesitates to do that. And we try to be so much more polite, and politeness will only take you so far. It's time for the Jewish people to remember their chutzpah. I give it to Susan.
Susan.
Thank you. I hope this answers the question, but I feel the need to speak about it in this with reference to this. We really, as progressive, when we were very active as Progressive Zionists of California in the party, we really wanted to bring a different paradigm, to introduce a paradigm of, and there's something called the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace Building, and the organization that put that on, we did quite a bit of work with them, called Alliance for Middle East Peace. And these are people, Palestinians, Israelis, that definitely disagree on many things, but they really want peace. They really want to do the hard work to build a lasting peace over time. And I tell you, I sent emails to many of the pro-Palestinian delegates that we really wanted to work with. And I was rejected by 98% of them. And then there was a small portion that was actually willing to sit down and have the conversation. We came up with a very good resolution that I think still stands to this day. And yet, resolutions, they don't necessarily move the needle in the direction, but this is the kind of work. If there are serious people that really want peace, the modern day anti-Zionism is not that. And yet, if there are people that really do want to work together on this issue, we could get great things done in the Democratic Party.
Thank you. Our next question, in the same vein, how should we handle reasonable criticism of Israel when it comes from vicious anti-Zionists like Jewish Voice for Peace, or if not now?
Yeah. Well, this gives me the opportunity to say something that I think it needs to be clarified, right? We have to distinguish anti-Zionism that is in opposition to Zionism, qua-Zionism, from anti-Zionism of sort of conspiranoid demonological kind, right? When anti-Zionism first emerged, it was an internal Jewish conversation among Jews, right? It hadn't yet reached the outside world. And there were Jews at the time who opposed Zionism on its own terms, right? They looked at the text of Zionism, they looked what the Zionists were proposing and advocating for, and they said, no, for some reason or another. But those reasons were so much different from the kind of anti-Zionism that we're largely talking about today. And it was mostly a conversation about what is the best strategy to keep Jews safe, right? We're talking about a time in the late 1800s when Jews are being murdered by the hundreds of thousands. Between 1880 and 1920, somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 Jews were murdered in pogroms. Jews were living in the Pale of Settlement because they had been ethnically cleansed from all parts of the Russian Empire except the Pale. And in the Pale, they were subject to apartheid-like laws, which were actually genocidal in intent. Konstantin Pobedonostsev, one of the chief advisors to the Tsar, wrote that the intent of the May laws, which were these anti-Jewish laws, was to cause 1/3 of Jews to emigrate and leave the Russian Empire, so ethnic cleansing. The second, another third to convert and cease to be Jewish, and the last third to starve to death. That was verbatim what he said, right? So these are the conditions that Jews are living with. And so it was primarily a question about how do we secure Jewish rights? How do we keep Jews safe, right? And the Zionists said, like, well, we have a solution, right? We should create our own society where we can determine our own fate, where we can defend ourselves, where we can, pass on our traditional life ways to our kids. We can speak our own indigenous language, et cetera, right? In other words, the Zionists were insisting on Jewish particularity, right? They didn't want to blend in. They wanted to be on the basis of their distinctiveness. And many Jews looked around and said, "Are you insane? At a time like this, you want to stand out? No, 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 no. The best strategy we got is keep your head down, right? Blend in, assimilate, right? That's what's going to keep us, that's the best strategy to keep Jews safe." So we oppose Zionism on those grounds. Another group of Jews said, I hear what you leave and form our own society elsewhere. We think we can reform this society. And I'm a part of a communist movement. I'm a part of an anarchist movement. I'm part of a socialist movement. I'm part of a liberal democratic movement. And that will deliver the goods. That will create a society where, as communism, as socialism, et cetera, promise, everybody's equal, right? It's a classless, stateless society. And Jews, like other people, will all be equal, right? And many Jews, of course, threw their weight behind those movements because, again, it was a movement that could maybe keep Jews safe and secure our rights, right? So those were the primary oppositions. And of course, the other opposition was, well, it's not quite time yet, right? Messiah has not returned. And so for religious reasons, which I wouldn't really consider anti-Zionism, right? I would consider it not quite yet Zionism, right? Like we're waiting. We haven't met the condition, but once that condition is met, oh yeah, repatriation, sovereignty, the whole bit, right? And of course, they imagined a Zionist society to look a little different than probably many of us would because we believe in democracy. They wanted a theocracy, right, on the basis of Jewish religious law. Okay. But none of that has anything to do with the anti-Zionism that we're talking about. It's not a conversation about what is the best strategy to keep Jews safe. That doesn't even enter the minds of most anti-Zionists. What you actually have is what developed when anti-Zionism, when Zionism reached the outside world, the non-Jewish world, where people saw Jews organizing for political power. Now, if you understand anti-Semitism, you understand it to be specifically an obsession with Jewish power. And so when the Jews started organizing for political power, including as Zionists, the broader world said, well, what are the Jews going to do with that political power, right? And then started spinning all kinds of conspiracy theories about what the Jews would do once they had all this power. Now, once the Zionists actually succeeded in creating a state with its own military, with its own intelligence services, right, et cetera, that's real power. So of course it was going to be a lightning rod for anti-Semitism, right? So when you see anti-Zionist Jews today, unfortunately, over the over the decades and over the century plus since Zionism really took off, those two forms of anti-Zionism have really fused to a degree that I don't think they can be disentangled anymore. Right? In the early 20th century, you have something emerge called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Right? Today, that is considered widely by many scholars to be the blueprint for contemporary anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Well, guess what? It was published in 1903, and some of the earliest editions of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion were called the Zionist Protocols. Right? And so when you speak to people today and you hear their conception of what is Zionism, and it sounds like nothing to do with what you believe as a Zionist, there's a reason why it sounds more like the protocols of Zion than any actually existing Zionism. And that is another reason why anti-Zionism it functions like anti-Semitism, because the Jew of the anti-Semitic imagination has nothing to do with Jews, qua Jews, as we actually exist. Well, guess what? The Zionism of the anti-Zionist imagination has almost nothing whatsoever to do with Zionism as we understand it, as it actually exists. So again, it functions like anti-Semitism. It uses the same concepts and tropes and stereotypes and conspiracy theories as anti-Semitism, right? And so when we speak to Jews today, all of this has to be on the table. We have to understand and I think proceed from that point of departure. And I'll see the rest of my time and let my colleagues jump in.
Thank you.
All right. So, yeah. So the worst person you know just made a great point, right? That's what we're talking about here. All right. Well, I'm a good person and I make bad points. Still not a wash. Look, the idea here is very simple. JVP and others, if they're in a coalition with a bunch of radical, pro-Palestinian activists, you're not going to shake them from that tree, right? But and there was actually a recent case in Silicon Valley, I think, where the city hall was trying to do some sort of, I don't know, Rainbow Alliance religious tradition ceremony around 9/11, get everyone together, and CARE was the Muslim representative. I think maybe it was Gary Kremen who had something to do with it, but they took a lot of the work that we did from Ian and showed them what these people were saying, what the CARE officials were saying. And I mean, it's insane stuff. It's straight up Nazi, woohoo, we love October 7th, insano stuff. And yeah, they canceled the whole thing. They're like, oh yeah, well, we want nothing to do with that. They were clear why they did it, because this is a radical group. So here's the answer to that problem. I don't really care if the worst person you know just made a really good point. You should seek to absolutely undermine them at every normative level at which they operate. You should have conversations with every city council that they're connected to. You should actively seek to undermine them. And I wouldn't talk to that person directly, even if they made a reasonable point. I wouldn't waste my breath. I would talk to everyone that they know and all the official legitimate institutions they're connected with. And I make sure that they know who they are. Because a lot of times this conversation is really, these networks where, JVP, CARE, and others are able to get institutional credo and recognition and standing. The only thing standing between, the only thing keeping that relationship intact is the knowledge gap. And if you're there to help fill it, be like, these are bad people. Let me show you why. That's the biggest and most important step that you can take. And you should, because they're seeking to eliminate you from public life. So this is a question of who fires first.
Thank you. Lauren.
This is actually just an observation from work, but those organizations like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace are themselves being normalized out of the conversation, anti-normalized. The same tactics that are being applied to our groups and organizations for being Zionist are now also slowly but surely being applied to organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, largely because they're not sufficiently supportive of Palestinian resistance and this very specific idea of October 7th being the model, Al-Aqsa flood being the model of resistance, and JVP being a part of the NGO industrial complex. And their work, especially with Palestinians, undermines Palestinian liberation because it's part of this larger, well-funded NGO network. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I think, they have had their moment in the spotlight for a long time, but that coalition is in trouble in its own ways. It's on the fringe for the time being. You may have heard this anti-Zionist Jewish Student Front group. There is a few of them. They emerged in the summer of like 2025. Like Georgetown, this is a DC metro area phenomenon more than anything else. And they said that they disaffiliate, they were JVP chapters, campus chapters, and they disaffiliated from JVP because JVP wasn't radical enough. Like JVP is seeking to make a Judaism without Zionism, and they're seeking more to do more with like Palestinian liberation, which is really interesting distinction. Like that's the thing that they're up to. So that's something I would think very seriously about, is like, if that's what JVP is going to end up facing, like what is ultimately this conversation really about? Is it really like about a reasonable point about settler violence? Like, okay, I can go off about settler violence, but like that's not really the conversation that you're actually wanting to have. And it kind of just goes back to reading the room, like, who am I talking to? Why do I need to be talking to this person in the first place? You know, to Matt's point, if it's just an unreasonable legislator, fine, I guess. But if I don't need to be talking to you, like, bye. So it's just like, you know, something to keep in mind when you're thinking about who you're in coalition with and how do we take advantage, if you will, of those coalition splits. It sounds kind of crappy, but they do it to us all the time. So
Thank you. Susan.
I have very little to add here. I mean, I think it's all been said very, very well. The one thing I would add is it's really important to examine the rhetoric. It's really important to look at the rhetoric. You know, most people here are probably familiar with AB 715, which is the landmark legislation to address anti-Semitism and other forms of hate in K through 12 education. The organizations fighting, JVP is one of the organizations fighting tooth and nail to overturn that and to basically defang it completely. And Ian wrote a statement on that, which you can see in our website, but it's the rhetoric of JVP, of Council on American Islamic Relations California, and Arab Resource and Organizing Center. Those are three organizations that are very involved, that are anti-Zionist, celebrated October 7th, every single one of them, and are seeking to overturn things to protect Jewish students. So check out our statement.
Thank you.
Can I make one other very brief point that I forgot to make? Would that be all right? Which is, none of this is new, right? Anti-Semitism has a very long history of co-opting Jews into service of anti-Semitism, right? In the wake of World War II, after the Holocaust, Simone de Beauvoir said something to the effect of, oppression would not be so oppressive if it did not have accomplices among the oppressed, right? So this is par for the course. This has always gone on. But the point I wanted to make is that I think we have to be laser focused on where the problem originates. If this is an issue of internalized anti-Semitism, I have to make this point. Internalized anti-Semitism is an externally inflicted wound. We have to stay laser focused on the fact that it is this society that has done this to our people, right? That has infected them with this mind virus and which has caused them to set themselves against our society. So I know there's a natural, I think, feeling that arises to be angry and want to attack these people, but they're suffering from a disease that was inflicted upon them by an anti-Semitic society, an anti-Semitic milieu. So I just really thought that was an important point to make.
Thank you. I have a question from one of our participants, and the question is, what do we do if the Democratic Party essentially tell us that we are not wanted, valued, shut us out? It seems almost that there is a Democratic Party conspiracy to push us away, while the Republican Party almost seems to be bending over backwards to invite us, using Israel as the wedge issue.
This is a complicated thing. Anti-Semitism is very much present in both political parties. It's expressing itself very differently. I would say the young cohorts of like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, deeply anti-Semitic, both like political ideologies, the many, many different political ideologies at this point of their young cohort, deeply anti-Semitic. Young Gen Z men, like they're fascist. A lot of them are groypers. I mean, there's a reason like Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and like the looks maxers and that kind of manosphere thing is so popular with those young men. So it's not like the right is necessarily any better, even if its gatekeepers may seem right now maybe better on very specific policy things pertaining to the Jewish community. The Jewish community has a lot of different concerns. Israel is but one of many things. And as it should be, like we live in the United States, I'm very interested that my roads be paved, that we have a busy intersection outside my house, that my kid doesn't die when he goes out and goes onto the street. That's top of mind for me. I can't say that the coalition, dealings with Lapid and Bennett are top of mind all of the time. So I would bear that in mind. Like, this is a problem that stems so much deeper than just like one acute moment in time with one political party. It's deeper than that. It's a cultural and societal rot that is not going to be fixed by, we talked to these one gatekeepers and we fixed it for like 10 years.
There's something else with that I'd like to add, and there's a recent Pew poll, and I will not get the numbers right, but actually the public perception of Israel is going way down, and it's higher among Democrats, and I think does that mean then? Therefore, that means we need to be anti-Israel, right? We cannot be overly simplistic in what these polls actually mean. There's probably something much more there. There's a lot of concern about what's happened in Gaza and the people there and how they're living. And a lot of that, of course, rests on Hamas's shoulders, but there's lots to say about how, what's happened since the war and what the plans are and what's going to happen there. So it is. I don't think political parties are necessarily the place for deep conversations, unfortunately. But I think it's very important to not just take things on face value, and we need to stand up for us. We need to be strong, and we need to insist that we be heard on this issue, and that people understand the dangers of anti-Zionism.
Thank you, Susan. Matthew?
Yeah, it's a scary proposition, but I don't exactly know what the question pretends. Like, what is that going to look like? What is the moment that we've crossed the Rubicon in the Democratic Party? Would it be like you have people that are saying we shouldn't fund Iron Dome? I mean, if it comes to something like that, I kind of think that the party at that point is committing collective suicide, right? I don't doubt that there will be there are no shortage of mistakes that will leave pies on Jewish faces. Some people are going to have an appetite to stick around and fight. Other people are going to leave. When we started organizing at PCC, one of the first things we did was reach out to fellow Democrats who felt like they were going to leave the party, and we'd say, it's more important that you stay here and fight. That's the first thing to understand. And it's not as though there's like great alternatives on the other side. Generally speaking, when Jews are made into refugees, there tends to be a tightening of walls. So if there's a mass exodus of Jews from the Democratic Party, I expect a reactionary movement, Republican one as well. Yeah, we just have to see what it all looks like. But at the end of the day, these are the political houses that are currently operative. Anything's possible. The world is changing. Maybe there'll be another party sometime soon, or the Democrats will go the way of the Whigs. If they do something monumentally stupid, like here in California, where they try to get a floor fight every year to shift the Overton window irrevocably against Israel and set the national trend, that's the inside baseball for the California Democratic Party. What all this organizing is about. That deserves its own mention, but that's the plan. They got to say something really dumb and to alienate Jewish voters. And what do you think? I mean, think about the people who want to do that, right? They're looking to create a lot of vacancies in the party's rank and file and leadership, and hopefully be able to fill them. That's the way these anti-Semitic leverages work, right? You create and then the whole time they're worried about what Jews will not replace us. Right? Who are you trying to replace? Okay, that's basically the way this thing goes full circle, right? A little bit of a little funhouse mirror there for you. All right, so like I said, it just depends on what it's going to look like, and we'll deal with the punches as they land. But the important thing is that we're mobilizing, and they don't realize their success here in California. They don't permanently shift the Overton window. This is our moment to fight about that, and let's hope we win. That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I really strongly agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I always say that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? So by ceding this, ceding the ground, by ceding the party, things are only going to get worse. If there's no countervailing voices, right, things are only going to get worse. And look, the other thing I'll say is, I spent years trying to really ring the alarm to say, don't take your eye off right-wing anti-Zionism, right? This was years before Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, et al. It's always been there on the right. It's always been there. In fact, in the 1980s, you have the the publication of the White Aryan Resistance, which was at the time one of the large white supremacist movements on the far right, doing literature reviews of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda, like literature. Right. The idea that ideas remain quarantined to an ideological sector and don't cross-pollinate has no basis in reality, right? So even if it's true that, right now, sort of anti-Zionism and anti-Israel hostility has a lot more overt momentum on the left, this can change within a matter of a year or two. And here's the last thing I'll say too. In about a month, maybe a month and a half or so, we're going to release. Simon Wiesenthal Center is going to release a report on Iranian sort of influence operations here in the United States. And of course, they're allied with Russia and a lot of this stuff. And one of their chief strategies is actually to align the far left and the far right along the terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. They're cultivating these syncretic politics, these red, brown, and green alliances as a strategy, right? Alexander Dugin, the chief sort of geostrategist and ideologue in Russia, the way that he frames this is neither left nor right, but against the center. They're cultivating the sort of authoritarian extremists at either end of the political spectrum in order to attack the liberal democratic center, right? So that's what's going on. So it's not really a left-right issue anymore. In fact, I'm not even sure that it really makes sense in 2026 to evaluate politics on the left-right spectrum. I think that whole thing has all but broken down.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please put this question in the chat.
My chat is completely disabled. I see you asking me what my question is, but it's disabled. I can't type.
Go ahead, Wendy, and say your question in live, please.
My question is where do we stand on groups like 5501 movement that are organizing the biggest protests right now, yet putting out Palestine is free Palestine is part of No Kings. Wear a kufiya or bring a Palestinian flag to show your solidarity. Stand against oppression. And that's put out by National 5501. What do we do when groups like Bend the Arc are trying to, when Jewish democratic groups are starting to want to align with Bend the Arc, another group that's anti-Israel. Do we know about Bend the Arc?
Thank you for that question. To the panelists.
Thank you.
I mean, I've actually seen what you've written about. It's definitely concerning. It reminds me of when we were first starting this work, starting to become more aware of this work, and the Women's March, right? What was happening in the Women's March? It was being completely co-opted by anti-Israel players. I guess you sort of have to pick and choose where you put your energy. I don't have a pat answer other than how Ian would probably approach that is to do the research on the organization, see what we can learn, let people know so people are more aware of who they are, maybe less reluctant to align with them and to become involved with them. But again, there's so much whack-a-mole to be to be done that I'm not discounting this. I'm just saying it's a very familiar pattern. But if it's something that is serious, I would do a deep research dive on it.
Well, the deep research is that they're putting out QR codes at all their events, and they're getting people to sign up. And then when they sign up to join the No Kings protest, they're getting anti-Semitic propaganda.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in quickly to say this too is a concerted. It's a strategy, right? And in fact, it's a well-worn strategy. It's a very effective strategy called issues linkage, right? You connect your your pet project to whatever is already people are already passionate about, right? As a way to grow your ideological movement and gain new recruits, you go into for example, an environmentalist space, and you say something to the effect of, well, yeah, isn't it terrible that these evil corporations are destroying our streams and polluting our air and destroying the environment? You know who owns those corporations, right? The Zionists, the Jews, right, et cetera. Bingo, bango, you've connected your issue to whatever thing that people are already passionate about. I do think, though, in these spaces, this is exactly why we have to be at the table, right? This is why I say that we have to have our people, right? People who are going to push back on this in each one of those spaces, right? So we have to be in the environmentalist groups. We have to be in the feminist groups. We have to be in the LGBTQ rights groups, right? Et cetera, because all of those spaces are being infiltrated. So we need our guardians at the gate, and we need to maybe be making these cases like, oh, okay, you're against kings. Have you seen the Middle East outside of Israel? It's pure monarchy and authoritarianism. What are we talking about here? You're against authoritarianism. You're against autocracy. You're pro-democracy. That's why you don't want kings. Okay. Bayard Rustin, the famous, Dr. King's right-hand man, the architect of the civil rights movement, he wrote a really powerful article where he basically argued that the ability for a movement like the civil rights movement to succeed depended upon the foundations, these democratic principles, the right to peaceable assembly, the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. That's what they depended on. That's why they had success. Well, he says anywhere where democracy gains a foothold, it has to be defended if you care about civil rights, if you care about human rights. Those are the cases we have to be making. But to make those cases, we have to be present in those spaces. So don't cede the ground as much as you can. Listen, we all got to have red lines, but as much as possible, stay in the fight. It's going to be uncomfortable, but if we cede the ground, it's only going to get worse in all those spaces.
Thank you.
What's interesting to me is 5150 from my problem children. It's a Fed op. It's a Fed operation. They're, Fed jacking a protest movement. It's not really a legitimate avenue for pro-Palestine, activism. So that's something worth keeping in mind when we're thinking about how do we want to sit and show up in coalition? Who is in coalition? It also happened at some No Kings, and this is going to be at some of these protests. It's going to really depend chapter to chapter also, your mileage may vary. That's true of Women's March too. It really kind of depends chapter to chapter what the deal is. But they had some folks try and interrupt the rallies with, some rabble rousing, and they shut that down immediately and said, that's not the point of this particular rally. We're talking about, democracy in the United States, and there's a time and a place for this, and that is not here. So just to keep that in mind, when you're trying to, talk about norms and values of where you are. But it's just so interesting to me that for the very extreme anti-Israel folks, No Kings isn't it. It's a Fed op, which I think is super funny. But also just something to think about when you're showing up. And you want to talk about norms and values.
Thank you. Matthew?
No, I'm good, man. I think everyone got that one.
Okay. So this is going to be our last question. And this question is, how has social media made our challenge greater, and how do we push back on it?
Oh, God. I'm so glad you asked this question. But social media is a huge part of all of this. I'll say like this. The social media companies, AI companies, other technology companies are handing the world's largest megaphone to individuals, movements, networks, and states who will use that megaphone in order to spread hatred, authoritarianism, violence, incitement to genocide, like all kind of. And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing it because, if it bleeds, it leads, as the old adage goes, as applied to traditional media, is still true, even more true when it comes to social media, right? If it's sensational, if it makes people's blood boil, right, it gets clicks, it gets engagement, right? And so when you go to these social media companies, and I've done a lot of work in this space, you go to these social media companies and say, hey, Meta, we've uncovered, this dozen groups on Facebook. They're filled with Holocaust deniers, people doing incitement to violence, like they're violating your terms of service over and over and over again. They should be banned from your platform. The response, and if they're honest about it, the response is, well, you just asked us to ban, let's say 10,000 individuals that you've discovered in these Facebook groups from our platform. That's 20,000 fewer eyeballs we can sell to advertisers, right? And I have a fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders to increase shareholder equity and not take measures that are going to undermine profitability. And you're asking me to undermine my profitability. Now, that's hard to argue against, right? Because you're basically saying like, okay, well, you should do it because it's the right thing to do. But guess what? If you do it, if you take those steps, the board will vote you out as CEO and put in somebody who's willing to actually protect the profitability of the company. So what actually we need to do is change the equation of how they make these decisions. On the one hand, yes, you might lose some advertising dollars. On the other hand, you might get sued for damages, right? Right now, they can't be sued for damages. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act indemnifies these companies against being held legally liable for the content that they or their algorithms propagate, right? With the idea that, well, it's being posted by third parties, it's not the decisions of the companies themselves, it's not their own action, it's third parties that are coming and posting on it on what is essentially a bulletin board, right? Which is a really flimsy argument because, after all, these companies are making decisions. They write algorithms that decide who sees what content is delivered to whom, in what form, when, etc. Right? That's a decision of the company, and they should be held liable. We last year in the last legislative session in California, we tried to pass a SB 771, Henry Stern's bill, that would have opened up the pathway to hold these companies at least civilly liable if plaintiffs can demonstrate that they were harmed by the content that was delivered to them or to somebody else who was then incited to violence, took it offline, and enacted real world violence, etc. Right? At least to hold them civilly liable. We picked up a whole bunch of co-sponsors for the bill. It made it all the way to the governor's desk, and then he vetoed it. And I think it was purely political sort of strategy. He's running for the presidency, and he needs that tech money, right? And so just on those grounds, I think that's, because he said, even in the veto statement, he said, I agree that this is a major problem, right? I think this bill has some issues, blah, blah, blah. He made some justifications of why he vetoed it, but he agrees that this is a major problem. I just don't think it's politically prudent, let's say, for him to do that right now and to take on the tech sector. But this is one of the things we need to do. The other thing, just very quickly, that I think we need to do is actually make Americans more resilient to disinformation, influence operations, etc. We have to harden America as a target for information war. Right now, we're a soft target. Americans should not be so easy to dupe, right? So the other thing that we need to do is invest in media literacy, AI literacy at the youngest age, right? We have to prepare young people in particular for not only the world that they're inheriting, but the world that they're already living in. So those are just two things.
Thank you. Lauren.
It certainly made a problem that was already festering, I think, and put it on steroids. I personally think we should all know a little less about each other, and we would all be better off for that. Yeah, I think it has given a lot of people a platform, and it's connected a lot of different people for better, and obviously in the instance that we were talking about here, for worse. And it's made it really complicated to have thoughtful conversations. I mean, also tech companies, to Vlad's point, they wrote the algorithms and they know how damaging those algorithms are. And you can't, they have been sued for harm to children specifically. And they have successfully been gone after on that way. I think it was Meta that was successfully sued, or it was either Meta or TikTok. They knew that it was promoting harmful eating disorders and promoting that content to very, very young girls specifically. And they knew and chose not to moderate that. I both work at ADL. We do our best to build relationships with tech companies. Some are more responsive than others. We just released a report on Instagram and Meta, for example, a couple of weeks ago. That was a bit disheartening to look at about the sheer amount of content that is just like not moderated and not taken down, despite it being flagged several times. We gave them a chance to take it down. Yeah, TikTok is actually one of the better organizations in terms of off-site stuff. If you're doing stupid things off the platform and they find out that you're doing dumb things off the platform, they will actually take action if it's stupid enough. And they do a pretty good job with Holocaust denial if you report it. Meta, not so much. X, hilarious. If you think X is doing anything, that's adorable. There's also the rise of other alternative platforms, which makes that even more complicated. Upscrolled is a really good example of that. That's an incubated social media platform incubated by Tech for Palestine, which is one of the organizers or like supporters or infrastructure givers of the Wikipedia editing project. And it allowed straight up terrorist organizations on that platform, the DFLP. There was an ISIS media account on there for a hot minute. So it's just given a lot of people a lot of like access to each other that we previously didn't have. And they know. I think the bigger conversations and the far more complicated conversations are around like code words and dog whistles, and Zionism has been a hot point and highly contested since at least 2021, when Meta was thinking about making that a bannable or a censurable word on the platform. And it's a fight that we haven't, we still are having with them about how do we talk about that? How do we keep terrorists, at the very least, how do we keep foreign terrorist organizations and their supporters from using their platforms for bad?
Matthew.
I'll try to be brief. Yeah, the current state of things, bad. We are operating at an except for some minor victories here and there. Under this president, it's not likely to change. Imagine if California, if they had actually passed Earnsville, where would the social media have gone? It would all gone to Texas, right? Quite possibly. If that's a state law, then they know exactly where they shouldn't be, right? So the economics of that don't necessarily work well for the governor either, right? So yeah, that's a pickle. That's going to be a really stinky pickle for a minute. And I don't think it's going to go well, because if you just allow social media to be the Wild West, and times get any harder than they do now, I think we're really going to see just how serious an accelerated cyber mob scenario can look like all over the country as a primary organizing principle for chaotic mobs and the anti-Semitic social media movements that will erupt into real world violence. Yeah, we're definitely staring down the pipe here at some pretty scary outcomes with no clear leadership in sight on this. Probably gonna have to wait until after the presidential elections before we can really talk about this in a federal way. So what do we do in the meantime, right? Because I've now described the smell of sewage to you. In the meantime, I really recommend that you get offline for Shabbos if you can, and keep in good touch with your community. And the best tools we have for fighting back now, again, in this environment, is the fact that personal relationships have become rarer and rarer in a world in which people are more and more atomized, and because of social media. And so those personal conversations, as a consequence, there's a real market for those. And I think that we should be seeking to mobilize at that level. Face-to-face conversations with legislators are going to be more important now than ever before. And so we should be building those kinds of, that's the only tool we have for resisting the present asymmetry.
Thank you, Matthew. Susan.
Yes, briefly, it's not just what's happening on social media. It's very important, obviously, and a lot is happening there, and a lot of it is very bad. But it's also how media is picking up what's on social media and presenting it as reality. And that has happened a few times. You'll remember when the hospital, there was an incident where early in the Israel-Gaza war that Israel bombed a hospital, and it turned out that it was not. It was a missile coming from PIJ or Hamas, and it hit the hospital, but it was already too late. The information was out there. I think the New York Times had already reported on it. So it's I think what Vlad was speaking to about just not taking anything on face value, starting to educate yourself on misinformation, on disinformation, how this information spreads, and what are the vulnerabilities, and how can we be more responsible stewards of that. However, in the age of bots and how information is spread so very quickly, misinformation is spread so very quickly. This is well beyond my pay grade, and I think our legislators need to get to work on this seriously.
I was asked a follow-up question, if I could quickly answer. Somebody is concerned about First Amendment limitations, right? That this curtails the First Amendment if the social media companies regulate speech on their platforms. It's not really a First Amendment issue, as I explained. The First Amendment only limits what the government can do to curtail speech, expression, etc. It says nothing about what private actors can do, right? Like if the Klan comes to me and says, wow, you have a lovely backyard, we'd love to throw a free speech Klan rally in your backyard, I can tell them to kick rocks because that's my private property and I don't want it to be used to spread incitement to hatred. Well, guess what? Elon Musk, Zuck et al. Can do the same thing. It's their private property. So when Nick Fuentes et al. Come to them and says, hey, we'd love to throw a digital Klan rally, they can tell them to kick rocks. Nothing compels them to allow the use of their private property for incitement to hatred, violence, etc. And if they choose to allow them to do that without any compulsion from outside forces, from the government, from anybody else, then they should be judged on that basis. Why are you doing that? Why did you decide to hand the world's biggest megaphone to people that you know will use it to spread Holocaust denialism, incitement to violence, genocide, right, etc.? So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So closing remarks. Tonight was not just another discussion. It was a meaningful exchange of ideas at a time when our communities are demanding clarity, accountability, and real solutions. And to all our panelists, thank you. You showed up prepared, you engaged directly, and you respected the importance of this platform. And to all our participants, thank you for being part of this process. And thank you all for your time, your participation, and your commitment to a better and more accountable future. Now I am going to pass it to Paul.
I want to remind everyone that this meeting, the presentation is over, the meeting is not yet over. So stick around. I want to add my thanks to our panelists, to Moran's. It was an excellent presentation on all fronts, I thought. And whatever we all now think the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is, I hope we all feel energized to fight it within the Democratic Party. And now I turn it back over to President Greg.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank each and every one of you panelists. You're welcome to stay for